Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Zinat Rahman, the Executive Director of the Institute of Politics. Welcome. Tonight, we're going to hear a conversation between IOP Director David Axelrod and Cody Keenan, who served as President Obama's chief speechwriter, and it's also a live taping of the Axe Files. So hang on to your seats. Before one of our students formally introduces our guests in a few minutes, I want to mention a couple of upcoming events that we have at the IOP, and then just go over some housekeeping. So tomorrow, IOP Director David Axelrod will launch Hacks and Acts, try to say that 10 times fast, which is a multi-part series focused on the upcoming midterms. And so tomorrow he's going to be in conversation with two pollsters, Tony Fabrizio and John Anzalone, along with Republican strategist and former IOP Pritzker Fellow Sarah Longwell. This will be in our living room at 3:30. You do have to register for it. It's a students-only thing. Just find more information at politics.uchicago.edu. On Wednesday, October 12th, journalist Essie Cupp will convene a diverse group of experts to unspool the history of gun use in America. This event will feature author Ryan Busey, Chad King, and University of Chicago Law School professor Allison LaCroix. It'll be in the Rubenstein Forum, University Room B, which I think is this room, starting at 5:30. And then on October 14th, all our applications are due for our IYC Bridge program, which is an opportunity for students to lead creative writing workshops at Illinois Youth Detention Center during the winter and spring quarters. So if that's something you're interested in, please get your application in. And then the midterms are 29 days away, and our student team, UCHI Votes, is working hard to get people registered, and you can be involved as a voting ambassador. So again, if you go to our website, you can find more information on how to be a voting ambassador. And of course, if you haven't registered to vote, please do so. Online registration has to be completed by October 23rd, and register by mail deadline must be postmarked by tomorrow, October 11th. And the in-person registration deadline is November 8th. So for today's audience questions, after today's moderated discussion, we will open the floor to take questions from you in the audience. Please line up to ask your questions. There'll be a microphone in the middle aisle, and we'll give priority to student questions. Please make sure your phones are on silent. And now we're going to hear formal introductions of our speaker and moderator from Elizabeth Snyder, who's a second year in the college and an IOP intern. Please join me in welcoming Elizabeth to the stage.
Good evening, and welcome to tonight's Institute of Politics Speaker Series event. As Zinat said, my name is Elizabeth, and I'm a second year in the college studying public policy and law letters and society. I'm also a communications intern at the IOP and have previously worked in speechwriting for former Virginia Governor Terry McAuliffe. Tonight, we are so lucky to be joined by Barack Obama's chief speechwriter, Cody Keenan, for a live taping of the Axe Files podcast, hosted by Institute of Politics Director David Axelrod. Cody Keenan is a political advisor and speechwriter who served as the director of speechwriting under President Barack Obama. As a Chicago native, Keenan studied political science at Northwestern University, and after graduation, he worked in the Senate office of Ted Kennedy before leaving the Hill to complete a master's in public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. While he completed his master's degree, Keenan worked for the Obama campaign during his summer and winter break, and after graduation, he accepted a full-time position on that campaign. When President Obama was elected in 2009, he took on the position of Deputy Director of Speechwriting, and in 2013, Keenan took over as Director of Speechwriting, and now he teaches a class in that area at Northwestern University. During his time at the White House, Keenan took the lead on writing speeches that included President Obama's eulogy for Ted Kennedy in 2009 and the president's address after Gabby Giffords was shot in 2011. In 2015, Keenan also wrote the speech Obama delivered to mark the 50th anniversary of Bloody Sunday. Tonight's event will focus on the extraordinary period of the Obama presidency that included the horrific massacre at a black church in South Carolina, a national reckoning with the Confederate flag, a major Supreme Court ruling, and the fraught and unforgettable path toward the president's ensuing speeches to the nation. Please join me in welcoming Cody Keenan and David Axelrod.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And before I begin this conversation, I just want to let you all know that I will thank Cody at the end of our conversation. as if it's the end of the conversation, but it's not the end of your conversation, because that's when we'll, after you give a hearty round of applause to him, pretending that it's all over, we will then take questions from the audience. So don't be fooled. The end is not the end. It's just the beginning. Cody Keenan, it's great to see you, brother. It's been a while.
Yeah, amen.
And I appreciate you being here. You're coming down from some school on the north side there.
Yeah, I should start by saying thanks for letting a Northwestern guy in here. I just came from class.
Where you teach speech writing. But it's good of you to be here at the Institute of Politics, and we're happy to have you. Chicago is really your original home. This is where you were born. Much of your youth was spent here. In fact, you were born in Wrigleyville.
That's right.
Yeah, and you remain to this day, I know, a loyal Cubs fan, Bears fan, and I was wondering if this is how you learned how to write so poignantly about sorrow and loss.
Yeah, the Venn diagram between being a Democrat and a Cubs and Bears fan is a circle.
And your folks were in the advertising business, creatives in the advertising. Tell me about them. What did they do?
Well, they were in client relations, which really is a fancy way of saying they took clients to Cubs games. But they taught me how to tell a story. You know, it's just they were selling. You know, it was the '80s, so they were selling cars and beer. But there's a story to be told in every commercial, and I was just there's a marketing component to politics that I picked up from them.
And were you a writer as a kid? Was writing a big thing in your life? Is that something that you inherited from your folks?
Yeah, my mother was also an English teacher in high school before she got into advertising. She got her master's in journalism from Northwestern. I was a bigger reader. I was a voracious reader, which I think is a direct parallel into good writing. I think to be a good writer, you have to be a good reader. And I'm doing a stop later on this tour in Ridgefield, Connecticut, which is where I end up going to high school, at public school there. And my conversant will be my 11th grade English teacher.
Yeah.
Because she set me on this course.
Watch your grammar.
Yeah.
Yeah. And was politics something that you talked about in your house a lot? Was that something of interest to your folks?
My parents bickered about it a lot at the dining table. My mom had always been a liberal. She'd volunteered on the McGovern campaign. She volunteered on the Ted Kennedy campaign in '80. My dad was a Reagan Republican, came from California. And they just kind of, bickered over politics all the time. Not real fights, not like today, right? Where if you have a MAGA person, a Democrat in one family, they might end up divorced. But it was just, that's how I absorbed it. And I wanted to know what they were arguing about. And we subscribed to the paper edition of the Tribune, and I'd plow through it to see what was going on.
When it was a real paper.
When you wrote there, yeah.
Yeah, well, that's what I meant. So you went off to Connecticut. Presumably they got jobs in the East. Mm-hmm. You were the quarterback of your football team, and you got injured. Blew out your knee.
Blew out my knee, everything in it. I was out for 2 years, and so I thought I wanted to be an orthopedic surgeon.
And then you came to Northwestern,
yeah.
And like a lot of aspiring doctors, you then confronted chemistry and became a poli-sci major.
That's why they make you take chemistry first. I loved biology. Give me that. But no, chemistry and I did not get along.
And was there a focus of your studies in poli-sci? Was it on American politics?
It was on American politics. And as a writer, I think the only poli-sci course that I just had a real aversion to was statistics and polling and political research. Mm-hmm. It just didn't make sense to me. Numbers, that's why I'm a writer. I couldn't crack that.
And then you graduated and faced the terror of trying to figure out what to do. And some friends inveigled you to come to Washington.
Yeah, a couple Northwestern guys pressured me into it, and I ended up living with one of them when I got there. And he was in Teach for America, which is incredibly important, but it was not useful to me to get a job in Washington. I knew nobody. My parents weren't donors, which is the way a lot of kids get jobs. I didn't know anyone, so I just kind of, back then we used this website called Hillzoo. I mean, this was before social media and before LinkedIn. And so there's this janky website called hillzoo.com where people would post internships. And I
Hilldo
applied.
sounds like a barber shop.
Yeah, it kind of like, you used Comic Sans, you know, it wasn't a great website, but I found my internship with Ted Kennedy there.
Uh-huh. And what was it, just that was an internship that was available, or did you, as a good Irishman, have an affinity for Kennedy, or what was it that attracted you to him?
Well, I didn't have I had a great political science degree and background and could do or write almost anything. I didn't have a great knowledge of how to get a job in politics, but I saw this ad for Ted Kennedy, and it's not just that I knew who he was, and that I aligned with him on all the issues, but as a young Democrat, the chance to work for the last Kennedy brother was something that I couldn't pass up.
You're too young, actually, to have remembered the other. You were born after the other Kennedy brothers were, but you had a sense of him and the whole Kennedy mystique.
There was a sense of purpose to it that I wanted in my own life, a sense of public service and the idea that we can do something to make this country better.
Yeah. Why? I mean, why were you imbued with that? I know you said your folks argued about politics, but what gave you that sense of mission about public service?
Well, when I was thinking about becoming a doctor and then switched to politics, I realized, why help just one person at a time when I can go help millions? But my dad is everything to me. But it was that my mom's kind of big-heartedness, you know, always chiding me. Well, they both did, to stand up to bullies, to always be nice to everyone in school, to help other people out. And that just, as you grow up, you try to think of other ways to do that. And because I grew up in, you know, but we ultimately moved from from Wrigleyville to Wilmette, and it was just a place with, you know, amazing public schools, public parks, an incredible public library, and you start to think, as you get older and realize what other people have and don't, that I wanted other people to have the same kind of chance that this country gave me, that living here gave me, and the people I saw doing that were Democrats.
You started in the mailroom, which normally, you know, that's like the sort of American story. You start in the mailroom and you work your way up. But it turns out that working in the mailroom for someone who wants to be a speechwriter or wants to write in service of politics and public service is a pretty meaningful place to be. Talk about the letters that you would read and presumably Ted Kennedy got letters from all over the country, because he was more than just a Massachusetts senator. He was an iconic figure when it came to the fight for health care and so many other things, equal education and so on.
Yeah, a lot of the letters flat out said, my senators don't represent me, so I'm writing to you. But there are also just a lot of people who just wanted to write to the last Kennedy brother, to touch that family in some way. But reading letters in the mailroom changed the way I thought about politics right off the bat. And my idea of what it looked like came from the TV show The West Wing, because that was popular when I was in college and graduated, and it was still on the air. And you get there and you read these letters and you realize quickly it's just very, very different. And these letters would be, you know, people would splash their private hopes and pains on the page. They wouldn't even necessarily be asking for anything particular. Anytime a letter would come in and say, I'm having a problem with my Social Security benefits or whatever, someone in the Boston office would figure that out right away. But a lot of the ones that came to him in DC they just wanted him to know what their life was like. And there was this kind of deep hope to it, even if they were sad, that somebody on the other end would care, would read this letter and care. And that changed the way I thought about politics forever, and that changed the way that I wrote forever.
Yeah. What did you do with the letters? You responded to each one of them, or did you pass them along to someone else? Or?
We had a legislative correspondent who would do it all. I was basically just my job to read and route them first. Ultimately, I graduated up to replying to them. But it's always, he was really good at constituent services.
Yeah, famously
really,
so.
Famously so. I mean, he had a whole office in Boston that just, if you had a problem, we're going to solve it in an hour.
Yeah. You know, what's interesting to me about that story, about you in the mailroom, is my experience with President Obama. And one of the first things that he did was insist that he get 10 letters a day. You know this, because he would share those letters with us. 10 letters a day from people across the country, people in the correspondence department of the White House would try and pick 10 that were representative of the kinds of letters they were getting on a particular day, and he would often respond to them, sometimes call them, and we'll talk a little bit later. I mean, we could talk about it now. There were people, Natoma Canfield was an example of a woman who really was struggling in the healthcare system, and she became a symbol for people within the White House and ultimately in speeches of why he was making that fight.
Mm-hmm. He still has her letter on his personal office wall right now, framed. And the great thing about these letters was, you know, we would have morning message meetings where we talk about what goes into a speech. We would have access to polling data, focus groups. But I often found the most profound things came from those letters. I would change the way I thought about an issue based on the way somebody described it in those letters. And what makes that important for speech writing is, you know, Bill Clinton was always famous for saying, "I feel your pain," right? But you can also show that you understand an audience what they're going through, rather than just have the president up there saying, "I understand student loans," well, which he did, because he had just finished paying them off about 4 years before he ran for president.
Yeah,
but
he's doing better now.
Yeah, but you could tell somebody's story in a speech, and we often would, and you'd see the audience nodding along, and they would say, "You know what, I understand that person, I am that person, that's my life story." And it was really profound, and there was this one in particular, Rebecca Erler, who wrote this long, beautiful letter, a woman from Minneapolis in 2014, and she just wanted the president to know what her life had been like through the recession and beyond. Didn't ask for anything. There were a couple things that could make life better for someone like me, she'd write, but it was such a beautiful letter that we reached out to her and asked her to introduce the president at an event in Minneapolis, and she did, and I stayed in touch. And then when it was coming time for the 2015 State of the Union address, rather than go through all the people in the First Lady's box, we built the speech just around this woman, Rebecca. The economic portion was all custom tailored to her life and her letter. And I texted with her this weekend. I mean, we've become friends because she and her husband are my age, and they're just cool. But
Have they bought the book?
I hope so. But they're wonderful.
You know, the other reason why it's so important, and we'll talk more about the interweaving of the stories and storytelling as part of speech writing, but the White House is such an isolating place. Our friend David Plouffe described it as like working in a submarine, and you look at the world through a periscope, and you can very quickly lose your sense of touch. You know, Washington has its own interests and conversations that often are disconnected with the conversations and concerns of people out in the country. So these letters are like a lifeline. Mm-hmm. And there were many times when the president would come into a policy meeting and say, you know, I got this letter and I'm really concerned about it. And it would change thinking about policy. So being in the mailroom was a hell of a place to start.
Yeah.
But you were determined not to stay in the mailroom, and ultimately you went off to graduate school. You went to the Kennedy School at Harvard. What did you hope to learn? Did you know by that point that you wanted to be a speechwriter?
No. I knew by that point, I actually wanted to be, I'd finally been promoted to legislative aide, so I had my own little portfolio. But as the only legislative aide without an advanced degree on Kennedy's staff, there were some other Senate offices just running circles around me, people who had been doing it for 30 years. And I actually went back to my boss and said, listen, I'm not doing the senator a service here. And so
Did you think you could get ahead in the organization by going to the Kennedy School?
I thought it would be easier if he wrote me a letter to get into the Kennedy School. And true to his word, he said, listen, he didn't know the name of the test, but he was like, if you get the average on the test, the school test, I'll write you a letter. And so I did. I got a 590 on the GRE, and he wrote me a letter. But I assumed I finally needed to get that numbers background. And the MPP program there had a deep background in economics and statistics. But it was also during the Kennedy School when the Obama campaign came calling about speech writing, and I changed my course. Because I had written a few speeches for Senator Kennedy at that point. He didn't have a speechwriter, so he just kind of wrote for your area. But I had been on the Senate, the floor.
So he didn't have a speechwriter.
Right.
One of the most celebrated speech makers of our time.
He had a legislative director who'd been with him for 40-something years, who just edited the heck out of every speech to get it where it needed to be. So he was kind of like a chief speechwriter, even though he didn't write anything for him. But what really sparked my interest was I was on the floor in 2004 at the convention when Obama gave that speech, because I was working for Ted Kennedy. We all got to go up for the week, and just that changed my life.
And did you say, I want to work on a speech like that?
Yeah, right away. I wanted to work on a speech like that. No, the first speech I wrote for Senator Kennedy was a floor speech, for the 100 people at home watching C-SPAN 2. And it's not particularly good. I still have it. But to watch somebody read what you've written out was electrifying. And I called my parents. I was like, turn on C-SPAN 2. And it was just really, really exciting. And I got to write a few more for him over time.
They found C-SPAN 2 in time to see your speech?
I think my mom actually emailed back, what channel is C-SPAN 2? I said, I don't know.
So the Obama campaign called, I think Stephanie Cutter,
Yeah.
a mutual friend of ours, suggested that who was very close to Ted Kennedy, suggested that you check out the Obama campaign. So you had minor speech writing experience, but you
Very.
Yeah,
Very
applied for
much.
that job. Favreau, is that who hired you?
Yeah, so John Favreau and I shared a mentor in Stephanie Cutter. She was Kennedy's communications director while I was there, and then she was Kerry's communications director in the 2004 campaign. And she connected us, and I think what mostly helped me get that job was that Favs was just drowning. He was the only writer at the time. He hadn't hired Adam Frankel yet.
I remember. I was the one who was drowning him.
Yeah, and he said, look, we can't pay you, but if you want to come out and intern, get out here.
And what was that experience like? I mean, I know what it was like for me, but what was it like for you, and how did your writing evolve through that campaign?
Well, it was terrifying because I don't think I've ever fully shaken the idea that I'm a bit of a dilettante who doesn't belong here. I'd probably written 10 speeches in my life, and here I am driving out to Chicago, which was awesome, to work on the Obama campaign. So on the drive from Boston, I listened to both of his books on tape to just try to get down his voice, get down his worldview. I never met him on the campaign. My experience was obviously different because you were traveling with him all the time, but he was only in Chicago maybe 3 times while I was there, and came in and he'd address the staff, but then go into high-level meetings with you and Pluff and everybody else. The first time I met him was in the Oval Office. I don't want to skip too far ahead, but so the campaign was really, the first thing I wrote for him on the campaign was his opening statement at the NAACP debate. And there were still 9 candidates in the race. And just to watch that was incredible. And then you just kind of bone up quickly on every issue under the sun, and Favs was a patient and dedicated mentor who would, make detailed edits to the speech, walk me through not just what Obama would want to say, but why he would want to say it, and kind of get us all on the same page with the campaign messaging.
You went to the White House and there was I've said this many times that I had a lot of wonderful experiences in the White House, but the consistently great experience was meeting every day with the speechwriters, or the wordsmiths, as I called you guys. It was, I think Rhodes may have been 30. Everybody else was in their 20s.
Yeah, Ben was the grizzled old man at 30.
Yeah. Favs was 26.
He's younger than me.
Yeah.
You're younger than me.
Yeah. Heady for you guys.
It was exciting and terrifying because you walk in there and then the economy is falling apart.
Yeah, it wasn't your fault, by the way.
Thank you. Yeah. But suddenly you're assigned a speech on housing policy, and I've never written about housing policies. You have to find somebody at Treasury or upstairs in the NEC to explain it to you, and then write it in a speech and the president go out. And it was like drinking out of a fire hose for a long time, and really exciting and heady, but also kind of scary too, because our own families were dealing with that at the time.
Yeah.
Everybody was.
Yeah. But you guys, I would say the first 10 or 15 minutes of those meetings were basically a lot of jokes.
Yeah, romper room.
Yeah, it was like a writer's room.
We were very punny.
Yeah, I enjoyed that.
Well, I've kept that tradition going. You used to you'd kind of raise your eyebrows but not look up from your BlackBerry and wish us all hello.
That hasn't changed.
Hello, wordsmiths, whenever we came in.
Yes.
And once you left and I became chief, I did that every morning with my speechwriters, and I still do it every morning with my students.
Yeah, yeah. And you run a speechwriting operation now, which we'll get to. You rose through the ranks. You were appointed at some point deputy chief speechwriter. I left the White House in January of 2011. One of the last things that happened when I was in the White House was the horrific shooting in Tucson, Arizona, of Gabby Giffords, Congresswoman Giffords. The president went down and gave the eulogy, he spoke at a memorial service for those who had died in that shooting. Obviously, Congresswoman Giffords mercifully survived, miraculously survived. And there was one, and I remember this very well, because everybody said after the speech, like, who wrote that speech? And this, I just want to read a couple of paragraphs of this, and I want you to talk about it. He was talking about a 9-year-old girl named Christina Taylor Greene, and Christina came out to see her congresswoman and was shot and killed. And he said, Christina was given to us on September 11, 2001, one of 50 babies born that day, to be pictured in a book called Faces of Hope. On either side of her photo in that book were simple wishes for a child's life. I hope you help those in need, read one. I hope you know all of the words to the national anthem and sing it with your hand over your heart. I hope you jump in rain puddles. And then he said, if there are rain puddles in heaven, Christina is jumping in them today. I get verklempt even when I read these words today. And here on earth, we place our hands over our hearts and commit ourselves as Americans to forging a country that is forever worthy of her gentle, happy spirit. Tell me about that particular, because that is the kind of thing that makes a speech memorable, powerful, meaningful. And I know it's the sort of thing that you as a speechwriter are looking for, to give that depth of feeling to a speech. Tell me about how that came about.
Yeah. We saved this for the end of the speech after he'd, in a eulogy, he takes time to remember all the victims, and in this one there were a lot. But then also kind of instruct Americans as to what we're supposed to do now that they're gone, what are our responsibilities. And my favorite part is even before that section you're reading, where I changed up the language so that it wasn't really the way Barack Obama would talk. It was the way that a little girl might talk, that she had gone to this event and she had just run for student council, and she thought that she wanted to go see her congresswoman, someone she was sure was good and pure and important. I wanted to describe what democracy might have looked like to a 9-year-old, and then we let her down. And thought about how he might want us to see the world kind of undimmed by cynicism. And then Kyle O'Connor, who was our junior speechwriter at the time, found this book. I still don't know how, this Faces of Hope book with her in it. And that's what the power of good research can do. I mean, it just lent itself to this extraordinary story. And then I think about speeches constantly, even if I'm not at my computer. They're just always in my head. It makes me an awful dinner companion when I'm trying to think through arguments, and I'll realize I haven't been listening to a word the other person has said. Yeah. And I remember that line came...
I know we're having dinner later, so thanks for the warning.
That line about rain puddles came to me that morning as I was getting ready for work, and the first thing I grab my BlackBerry and I email it to myself, and then when I get to work, weave it into the speech, and that gets me too. If you watch the last couple minutes of that speech, it is something.
Yeah. Well, anyone with a beating heart, I think, would feel the same way. We all think of our kids and grandkids, and so let's talk. You became the chief speechwriter in 2013 when Jon Favreau left. I want to talk about this wonderful book, Grace, President Obama and 10 Days in the Battle for America. There's so many things I love about the book, but one of them is it really does give you a sense of what goes into writing a speech, and one of them is that, the letters, the history, the hidden revelatory story. And you say research is more, I mean, I'm sure you put a premium on that, and the staff put a premium on that.
Mm-hmm. I read constantly in the White House, not just custom tailored for each speech, but just all the time, everything I could, because each of us as individuals is not the font of all wisdom. We don't have a monopoly on good ideas. I'd get them from anywhere, and then just try to improve on them. You know, for the Selma speech that I used to start the book, I read part of the Taylor Branch trilogy, just to really get in the mindset of. I wanted to know what the marchers were doing.
Trilogy on the Civil Rights Movement.
On the Civil Rights Movement. I wanted to know what the marchers were doing that morning to get ready and prepare.
This was the speech marking the 50th anniversary of Bloody Sunday.
Mm-hmm. And it's just, doing that kind of reading is so important because empathy is really critical to speech writing. Super critical. You want to...
Kind of important to governing, too, I'd argue, but yeah.
That and a sense of shame, I think, are missing from our politics. But there are limits to empathy. You can imagine, right, for Tucson and Newtown, you can imagine what it might be like to lose a child, but if you don't have children yet, it's a stretch, and you need to talk to people who do. I have one now, so I think I finally get it, but if I was writing about anything that was outside my own lived experience, I would make it a real point to read up or talk to the president or talk to somebody else and try to get into the audience's head first.
Talk about why you chose. I know this book has been in your head. You talk about being in your head, which obviously is an expansive place. You talked about this 10 days and this book. You were helping President Obama on his memoirs. And all during that period, you were saying, "I've got this book in my head that I really need to write." And it was about these 10 days. You were in the White House for
2,922 days.
Yeah, but who's counting?
Right.
And you chose these 10.
Yeah.
Why did you choose these 10?
I mean, on its own, you'll remember all of the stories and all of the events in this book. You won't remember that they all happened in the same 10-day span. I mean, that in and of itself is a story that demands to be told, and part of me wanted it to be this book that lives through history, so that someday my daughter reads this and her generation reads this and goes, wow. I remember someone wrote, I can't remember who, that it was too far-fetched for an entire season of The West Wing, everything that was created in these 10 days. But every event of those 10 days also says something profound about America. You know, they began, day one was the shooting in Charleston, where a white supremacist walked into a black church. He'd been self-radicalized and obsessed with Confederate iconography and murdered 8 black parishioners and their pastor during Bible study. And then I get into the workings of the White House, too. How do we snap to? Does the president give a statement the next morning? What do we say? What is the president supposed to do in that situation? How do we prepare it? The families of the victims forgave the killer the day after that, which was just truly extraordinary on live television. We're all watching it with our mouths open. And that kind of changed the tone of the week, I think. You know, I don't have data to back it up, but it changed things in the White House. President Obama did not want to go give a eulogy. He didn't want to speak.
Explain why.
We had done over a dozen at that point after mass shootings. And this goes back a few years, the shooting in Newtown, Connecticut, where 20 little kids were murdered in their classrooms along with 6 of their educators, was right after he'd been reelected. And he put aside his second-term agenda right out of the gate to try to do something about guns, because it would just, what an abdication of leadership that would be if he didn't. And he had a little boost by Joe Manchin and Pat Toomey, who's an arch-conservative from Pennsylvania with an A rating from the NRA. They both had one. They decided to work together on a background checks bill. And even though we knew the odds in the Senate would be long, that gives you something to try for. And so he traveled the country for a few months. He made it a centerpiece of his State of the Union address, big, emotional, powerful ending. And in the end, in April, it failed. It didn't just fail. Republicans blocked a vote on it, with the parents of the Newtown kids watching from the gallery. And that's about as cynical as I've ever seen Barack Obama get. He went out and spoke in the Rose Garden with those families. I handed him a draft of the speech, and he said, look, I'm going to use this as a template, but I'm just going to wing it.
Were these the remarks where he literally cried.
That was the day. That was the day of the Newtown shooting.
Day of the Newtown
He
shooting.
cried in the briefing.
But there was real anger
Yeah.
that day. You know, he's as you know, and as everyone knows, but he's remarkably composed at all times, and this was a time when he just, as you say, let it rip.
Yeah, and he came in after that speech into the outer Oval Office, which is this room just off the Oval where his assistants sit, and he was almost yelling once the door closed, and he said, "What am I going to do the next time this happens? What am I going to say? I don't want to speak. If we've decided as a country that we're not going to do anything about this, then I don't want to be the one who
offers thoughts and prayer."
Yeah, and just gives the country the signal that it's okay to move on before the next one. Mm-hmm. And I wondered if he'd hold true to that after Charleston.
But there was a moment in these 10 days when you weren't sure whether he was going to speak or not.
I mean, I got to confess, I was relieved when he didn't want to, because I didn't know what to write after this one. And we knew this one's much more charged than usual because it goes right into our oldest wounds. You know, it goes right into race. And, you know, the Confederate flag was omnipresent, you know, in that shooting and in the days afterwards. But what those families did changed the way he was thinking about it. But also you started to see some Republicans in the South come out against the flag for the first time. Strom Thurmond's son, who was a Republican state rep in South Carolina, said it's time for it to come down. The Republican governor of Alabama just quietly ordered it to come down over the State House. And mass retailers said we're going to stop selling it. And things started feeling a little different than usual after a mass shooting. And
we should just say parenthetically, because the great thing about the book is that it's sequential. So you do get a sense of what each day was like. And the Supreme Court was considering two extraordinarily important cases at the same time. You did not know how the Supreme Court was going to rule. So you're managing a staff that's trying to write multiple scenarios for these events.
Yeah.
Talk about the Supreme Court cases.
I had this great team of speechwriters, and so we knew that the Supreme Court was looking at Obamacare for the second time and marriage equality. And it turned out that there were multiple options for each. I mean, we find out the same time as everybody else in America. You know, we had a lawyer in the courtroom.
That was in the days where they weren't leaked in advance.
That's right. We had a lawyer in the courtroom, but we would just find out by watching cable news. So you don't want to make America wait several hours for the president to speak after something that big. So we prepared basically win and lose remarks for each. And then the lawyers came in, they were like, well, actually, there are 4 different options for each. And I was just like, get out. So we were working on those too. But again, those go to something fundamental about America. You know, if Charleston was all about race and whether or not we're going to stand up to white supremacy and stand up for equal rights, these cases were about, does this country guarantee some measure of financial security and health insurance to poor people and working people? Does this country, are we going to allow our gay brothers and sisters to get married, or are we going to deem them some sort of second-class citizen? All these questions were just coming to the fore at once in these 10 days, and we had to write about them the entire time.
And so returning to the speech in Charleston, you describe in the book sort of agonizing process of trying to figure out what to write, including sleepless nights, long strolls, cigarettes.
I've quit now. I have a daughter.
Good.
My mother found out that I smoked from reading this book, and I knew she wouldn't. It would break her heart.
You deceived her this long, huh?
Yeah.
So talk about the evolution of that speech. Well, and describe, this was the last sort of event in this book, the Supreme Court. In fact, you flew off to Charleston when the day the Supreme Court ruled on same-sex marriage. Mm-hmm. But the speech this speech was a particularly difficult speech. In some ways, those speeches, given the fact that they came out as you hoped, as the president hoped, were easy to write. This one was really hard.
Really hard. And I'm very honest in this book, too, about what a challenge it is to write for him in general, let alone on something of this important and all these different third rails in one speech. It helped that the mood in the White House was slowly lifting over the course of the week, and just the way the country is conducting itself, and then suddenly Obamacare wins again, and then marriage equality becomes a reality, and a bunch of our colleagues, were suddenly told you can get married, which we always knew should be true, but to finally get it was a huge relief. But I'd been struggling with this speech all week long. I'm glad you mentioned the all-nighter. It's one of my favorite passages in the book, just describing how weird an all-nighter in the West Wing is. But I knew that the draft I'd been working on wasn't there. And he's talked about this publicly, too. He talked about it on the Springsteen podcast he did. I knew it wasn't there. And he hadn't given me much to go on, and he knew that, too. But you used to have a phrase that just drove us insane when you'd read a draft and you'd say, what was it about the runway? It was like, I don't think we're landing on the runway, or...
I don't remember exactly, but yes, I used to send you guys back to the drawing board quite a bit.
Yeah. I think we're undershooting the runway here, something like that. And we'd all just go, axe.
Yeah.
But I knew it, but I was out of time, too. And so I gave it to him Thursday evening, and I'd agonized over it for 3 days. He calls me back to the White House 3 hours later, 11 p.m., and he tore up the last 2 pages in their entirety, which he'd never done to me before. And he'd rewritten them in 3 hours after I'd had 3 days, and they just soared. I had the phrase Amazing Grace, and that's where he started tearing it up, and he wrote out the lyrics. And he, more importantly, used the lyrics to build a structure for the back half of the speech, it's one of those things where in retrospect I just kick myself for not thinking of it, because it's beautifully simple, but I'd been in my own head all week long I was terrified writing about race and the Confederate flag and guns coming from him to a country that was still a little bit on edge. But this was one of the things that made him such a great boss. He could have been angry at me. He could have sent it to somebody else and just excised me from the equation entirely. He sat me down and walked me through it. And it was the first time I ever apologized to him for not hitting the mark. But he said, look, brother, we're collaborators. You gave me what I needed to work with here.
Which I don't know how many speeches. You guys were superb speechwriters. I don't know how many speeches we gave him, knowing that the speech was an A- speech, and that he would make it an A+ speech, and that he would buff it up. But you always like to say, good speechwriters say, well, that's really his work. But he really, no matter how good you were, there always was this sense that he's the best writer in the group.
That's what made it so hard to write for him. Every time, we knew he just wanted something to work with. That wasn't enough for us. We wanted to impress him. We wanted to prove that we deserved to be there. We all suffered from some form of imposter syndrome. And he made it abundantly clear a lot of the time that we should feel that way. Not always. There were plenty of times where he was like, I don't know, just write something. But not on the big stuff. On the big stuff, he delivered. And so you were talking about the final morning, where
Before you get there, that speech that inspired you in 2004, I was working with him on his Senate race. We conspired to get the keynote speech. He was just a state senator from Illinois, but he had been nominated for the Senate, the U.S. Senate, and we really campaigned to get him this speech, and then had long negotiations about how much time they were going to give him. They said 8 minutes. We said 28. I think it was 17. And as you'll appreciate as a good speechwriter, the 17-minute draft was probably better than the 28-minute draft.
Oh, and harder.
Yes, but he was the author of that speech. We made small suggestions. We did some of the editing because he refused to cut he didn't want to do it. But
he's told me several times he wrote that himself.
Yes, and I'm here to attest to that.
Yeah.
I'm here to attest to that. And as you know, because I used to say to everyone, go back and read that. That's the foundational kind of statement of values and principles for Barack Obama. But really, breathtaking, you know, and I, working for him, got this speech, and I said, my God, this is going to be one of the great convention speeches of all time. Anyway, that morning.
Yeah, I mean, it's important that you just said all that. He is our chief speechwriter. I say that several times in this book. I think people have seen enough of Pete Souza's photos to know just how much he works on this stuff.
Yeah.
And it'll all be in the library just down the street someday for people to look at, and I can't wait.
Yeah, yeah. Unless he spirited some off and hid him in his basement.
Don't do it. Eric Schultz is going to call you in 5 minutes. So there, you know, I'm both discouraged and fired up by what's happened with the speech, and I've slept 3 hours in 3 days, and I was working on the speech right through 10 a.m., which is when decisions come down. I forgot to turn my TV on to see what would happen with marriage equality. We knew that was going to be Friday because the court likes to be dramatic and hold them for the last day. And I start hearing whoops and cheers from all over the West Wing, and I just know that we won. And you turn it on, you see, and by we I mean America, not Barack Obama.
Right.
You see these joyous scenes at the Supreme Court, and like you can't help but get a little bit choked up.
Yeah.
So I go up to see him, and a young woman on our team named Sarah Perry had drafted his marriage equality remarks for the morning, and he goes out and did some beautiful ad-libbing on it too.
Yeah, I want to just put a pin in that because one of the pages I folded over in this book was from that. If I can find it, it may be that I can't. Hold on. Oh yeah, you write. He hits the last line, and you write, and you're about running for the helicopter to go down to South Carolina, and you write, but he kept going. I cocked my head and watched. It wasn't rare that he would ad-lib. He'd do it all the time. It was rare that he'd do it when there were no further words on the screen to return to. He was on his own here. I was curious as to where he'd fly and how he'd land this plane. And then his words, that's the consequence of a decision from the Supreme Court, but more importantly, it's a consequence of the countless small acts of courage of millions of people across decades who stood up, who came out, who talked to parents who loved their children no matter what, folks who were willing to endure bullying and taunts and stayed strong and came to believe in themselves and who they were and slowly made an entire country realize that love is love. What an extraordinary achievement. What a vindication of the belief that ordinary people can do extraordinary things. What a reminder of what Bobby Kennedy once said about how small actions can be like pebbles being thrown into a still lake and ripples of hope cascade outwards and change the world. Those countless, often anonymous heroes, they deserve our thanks. They should be very proud. America should be very proud.
You just read that about 10 times faster than he did at the time.
Yeah, and he had to catch a helicopter.
He spoke even more slowly than usual, and I still to this day believe that he was genuinely moved that the country had come so far so fast on a civil rights and equal rights issue. And I asked him about that once, and he said, no, man, the reason I was talking so slowly is I was just tired from being up all night rewriting your speech. But I knew that wasn't true because he gave it back to me at 11 p.m., and he was probably up for several more hours doing something else. I really believe he was genuinely moved in that moment. And then, so the military is precise. 5 minutes later, the helicopter lands on the South Lawn, and we're off for Charleston.
Yeah, a remarkable ad-lib that speaks to the quality of his thought, but also his command of language. What you found out on the way down to Charleston is that he also had some command of music.
Yeah.
Because you wrote the speech, and he said to you guys on the plane, on the helicopter, I may sing. And I think everybody remembers that.
Yeah. He said if it feels right, I might sing it. And I was so tired. It was just like, normally I'm risk averse. I will just instinctively find reasons why he shouldn't do something. But at that moment, it had been a joyous morning already, and I hadn't slept in days. So it was just like, you do you, man, you know, go for it. And once you see, he understood the AME Church. He knew that they would be there for him. He knew that they would jump in and join him. And when you see it, you know, it's just not a question.
And what was it like? You write about this, but watching that actually happen. I mean, I remember watching it from 1,000 something miles away and how moving it was, but to have been part of this process and to see it actually happen was extraordinary.
I was about 10 miles away.
Yeah, you were.
I stayed on Air Force One.
Yeah.
Because he had made more edits to the speech, and I didn't want to risk the wireless cards not working en route to the church or to the arena. So I stayed behind, made the edits, but there was for me, selfishly, there was something kind of just nice in being alone and getting to watch it on television and just let all that pressure kind of pour off my shoulders.
And not a bad plane.
Not a bad plane.
Yeah.
I was watching him on TV, and he paused for 11 seconds before he started singing. And I knew he was going to sing, but I started immediately panicking that everyone at home would think he was missing a page, like a page wasn't in there. But then he collected himself and started to sing.
Yeah. And what did you say to him when he came back?
I asked him what the pause was all about, if he was trying to create some drama, and he goes, "No, man, you know what the thing about Amazing Grace is?" And I said, "Obviously not." He said, "You got to start low, otherwise when you get to a wretch like me, your voice cracks. So you gotta really push your diaphragm down and get into it."
Cody, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that you also interwoven through this was your courting of your now wife, Kristen, who was a research director at the White House, which is this, if you were going to write a situation comedy, you would write about a romance between the chief speechwriter and the research director, whose job it is to poke holes in everything that the speechwriter writes.
Yeah. It was her job to tell me I was wrong multiple times a day, every single day for 7 years.
Yeah. And you guys thought this was good practice for marriage?
We're still married.
Yeah.
We got our squabbles out of the way at work. But I write about her because she was my hero. She was the only reason that I could keep writing at that level for that long. And that was true about everyone in our White House. This sounds like such a weird thing to say now after the past several years, but we loved each other.
Yeah.
We were all forged during that first campaign, and more people stuck around for 8 years than any other White House.
Yeah.
Because we loved each other. We lived together. We got married to each other. I joke with the president now that he's got dozens of little grandbabies across the country.
Yeah.
From people who met and got married by working for him.
Yeah. Yeah. I just had a new grandson this week, and he was one of the first people I sent a picture to.
Yeah. Oh, he loves that.
Yeah.
Loves that.
Yeah. I want to just two things before we finish. One is personal about about the role of being a White House staffer generally, speechwriter, because of the intimacy of your relationship. You literally inhabit someone else's head, and you become their wordsmith. And to do that, you really have to have a mind meld. You did that for 8 years, more than 8 years, really, because in the campaign as well. You were a young guy when you started. You had a few gray hairs when you left. And then you worked for him for several years more. What are the challenges of that? You're obviously, everyone who's listening to this podcast can see, you're an incredibly bright, thoughtful, fluent person in your own right. But one has to sort of subjugate all of your own identity in some ways to the principle. How do you deal with that?
It's hard. I had a lot of anxiety dreams, and still do sometimes, usually about him wanting to know where the speech was, and I didn't know that there was one, or it's not ready, but getting into his head was always a complicated task, not just because we had different upbringings, but he had this moral imagination to him that is what really took the speeches to a higher place than I could reach. And it was a challenge, and the challenge of writing this book was actually breaking myself of writing like him, trying to write differently. That was really difficult. And when I went back and reread the first few chapters, they sounded like him. And I went back and rewrote those towards the end of the process.
Mm-hmm. And was there a sense at some point, and I'm maybe tipping my mitt because we've had conversations, but just of, okay, I got to get on with the rest of my life and be Cody Keenan now, not the president's speechwriter.
He would tell me that too, though. He would joke, even though he asked me to stick with him, he would say, you know, it's time for you to figure out what you want to do and get out of here. And that's where this book came in. I knew, I didn't feel good starting this while he was still paying me to write about him, so I waited until that was over. But I'll confess, I really wanted to prove that I could do something without him. It helped that he tweeted about my book. I'll gladly take that. But I'm proud of this book for a lot of reasons. There are a lot of different reasons I wrote it. That's the private one to me. And he read an early copy and sent a really nice note last week. And that means everything.
Yeah. And you're also, you're now running Fenway Partners and
Fenway Strategies.
Fenway Strategies, sorry. Writing speeches for a whole bunch of people, managing a staff again. You're teaching speech writing up there at Northwestern, as we said. And you have a baby.
Yeah, Gracie.
And the baby's name is Grace.
Yeah, she and the book were born at the same time.
Yeah.
She's awesome. I miss her while I'm traveling, but they're both named after the concept, obviously, not each other. But we found out, we just moved to New York 2 months before the pandemic hit, and then we found out Kristen was pregnant 2 weeks before New York City shut down. And remember, it was terrible in New York City. 30,000 people died pretty quickly. So that was a frightening year between the pandemic and kind of all the upheaval after George Floyd. As exciting as that was, it was also unsettling, and the election that went on for a while. She was there's no such thing as a relatively easy pregnancy, but she was complication free, and every night she would just kind of kick at the same time like clockwork, and she was just, we didn't deserve it, but she visited grace upon us for that whole year.
Yeah.
So it was a no-brainer.
Finally, I just want to ask you, reading this book was a joyful experience.
Thank you.
And especially having lived some of that journey with you and him. But I think anyone who reads this book will get a sense of idealism, a sense of possibility, a sense of hope, a sense that things can actually turn out the right way. But I also had a feeling reading it that I was reading it through kind of sepia-colored glasses, because these have not been particularly hopeful times. These have not been times of unity in our country.
So you've read the epilogue.
How do you look at things today? How does someone who experienced this experience, who's seen progress, how do you view the world now? And what do you have to say? We got some young people in our audience. What do you have to say to them about the possibilities of the future?
Yeah, I don't see a conflict between writing about this experience and that it was hopeful and sometimes joyful and fun to do this, to struggle to do good work in democracy with the realities we're living through now. Because it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows in the Obama White House either. But what I do want young people to take away from it is that it is a worthy endeavor. It's worthy of your time and your energy. You will, you may never be lucky enough to join a campaign like ours or to work for someone like Barack, but boy, I shouldn't say that out loud, like President Obama. But if you join a team that is committed to something bigger, it really can be fun. And another theme of this book is that none of these things that happened in those 10 days were really his triumphs. He pushed Obamacare through, but that was the result of a 100-year movement for universal health care, and we're still not there yet. Marriage equality was a result of a 50-year movement for LGBTQ rights. We're not done with civil rights. Out of the 2,922 days in the White House, we usually went unhappy if we just moved the ball forward just a little bit. But all of those days are what contribute to the big victories. And democracy can be really frustrating. Working in the White House, working in Congress can be really, really frustrating. It can also be extremely rewarding. And if we did have more people in public service who thought that way, who cared, who knew that their efforts could make a difference even if it takes a long time, we'd be in a better place. And it's not impossible. And that also doesn't gloss over all the very real work we have to do right now to preserve this democracy and keep it alive.
Or honest differences on issues that in a democracy you have to thrash out in good faith for us to truly make progress. The book is Grace, President Obama and 10 Days in the Battle for America. You said earlier, Cody, that we loved each other in the White House. I certainly feel that way about you. And as such, I'm incredibly proud of this work, and I hope that everybody reads the book. Thank you so much for being here.
Love you back. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. As aforementioned, now it's your turn. Here's a microphone in the middle of the room. Don't be shy. I could continue to banter through the night.
Leadership role, leadership role.
Hello, thank you for coming. My name is Zachary Leiter. I'm a second year in the college. I had a question about, you talked about...
The other thing are the books out there? You can buy this book right outside here, and I really, really encourage you to do it. I would not mislead you. It will be the best purchase you've made today.
At least this week.
This week, this year. It'll be the best book you've read in a really long time.
And I'll happily sign them all.
You talked about doing research.
Yeah, he'll be out there signing them too. Go ahead.
No worries. You talked about doing research in various issues to write speeches with subject matters you were unfamiliar with. But I wondered whether you could talk a little bit about the process, especially at the beginning of your work with former President Obama, about writing for someone else's voice and someone else's speaking style.
Yeah, it takes a lot of effort just to try to inhabit them. And like I said, as a junior speechwriter, I didn't get to spend a lot of time with him at first. So I leaned on John, but I listened to his books on tape just driving out to Chicago, and I watched as many YouTubes as I could of him speaking. But you really want to take it farther than just understanding maybe what he wants to say. You really want to know why he wants to say it. And I tell all young budding speechwriters now to demand time with your principal, which is a tough ask sometimes, but it's more for their benefit than yours to know that what they want to say isn't filtered by a communications team, that it's getting directly to you, that you are hearing straight from them. And I tell the same thing. I tell the same thing to principals and CEOs and whoever. You know, spend time with your speechwriter. It's really for your benefit. It comes with time, you know, like anything else.
Also important to know their stories.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, and I'd ask him all the time, hey, do you have a personal story here? I'd try to give him a prompt. I'd try to rile him up in some way to see what I could shake loose.
Sad to say, no, I don't have any personal stories. Anyway, go ahead.
Hi, my name's Yang. I'm a graduate student in sociology. So I read a lot about Obama from his books, and he is often considered an idealist, but especially comparing with his predecessor and the guy coming after him. But he is also a pragmatic realist, citing Reinhold Niebuhr frequently in his book.
Yeah.
So I wonder how you and Obama together manage the temptation to be carried away by idealism and, you know, writing the flowery, literary prose in face of some very grim reality. How do you manage that sort of temptation?
Sure. I don't see a conflict between the two. I think you can be idealistic and realistic at the same time. I don't think you should ever lose sight of the vision thing, of the world as you want it to be, but you can also know the world as it is and write about that. I mean, all of our eulogies, for example, were full of flowery rhetoric, but also very realistic about what we need to do as a country in order to change. And you know, we could talk for hours about the Obamacare battle, but that was a classic clash of, do you stay true to your kind of highest hopes, or do you actually get the job done? Even if it's not as satisfying as you wish it was. You know, do you choose between, if the choice is between 0, 50, or 100, everybody wants 100, but you might just not get it. So you take what you can get, you protect it, and then you hope that the next people can come along and do even better. And that's just part of governing.
That's the modulation of democracy that you have to master to be
I write a lot in this book too about the compromises you have to make with yourself. You know, we were all young progressives who just wanted to scream right and wrong from the roof of the White House, but you do need to make decisions. Is it worth sacrificing re-election to be a purist, or do you want to win so that you can get the things done that you promised? And it's not always satisfying, but it's a very real debate you have to have when you enter public service.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Nora Thompson. I am a first-year MPP student here, and I was actually born and raised in Tucson, Arizona. Gabby Giffords was my congresswoman, and I can remember exactly where I was during that specific speech that you talked about writing. So I was wondering, knowing that, you know, you have the weight of like the world's eyes on you in that moment, do you find that that helps your writing, or do you find that that hurts your writing, or how do you navigate that space?
It hurt my writing, so I tried to avoid it. Shorter deadlines always helped me. It's sort of like, I just saw the movie Top Gun Maverick, and they keep repeating in there, don't think, just do. And the less time I had, the less you could think and the more you could just do.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Ali Faluji. I'm actually not affiliated with the university. I'm also a Northwestern alum.
All right,
Made my way down here.
What's going on here?
I wanted to follow up a little bit more about this question of the gap between kind of the sense of pragmatism and the sense of idealism. I know there's often this sense that the Obama administration in a lot of ways was thwarted in terms of the things that they wanted to accomplish, but you also spoke, I think, to this internal sense of President Obama walking back into the room and expressing a degree of frustration I don't think was very, that the rest of us, I think, were privy to. I'm curious if you could speak a little bit more to kind of this gap and how the president navigated it, and kind of, I don't know, maybe specific situations where you found that it felt particularly untenable.
Yeah, sure. You just push constantly and you do your best. And with Obamacare, probably the easiest way to explain it is, you know, he would have loved to do single payer, but we had 59 votes for that in the Senate. We did not have 60, the end. And you can keep pushing and pushing on a stone that's not going to move, or you can just do what you can and end up covering 30 million people instead of the full 45. And, you know, you can view that as a failure, or you can view that as covering 30 million people and then securing that and going to get the next 15. I prefer to view that as a success. But I understand people's disappointment if you just can't go in there and do whatever you want. But that's not democracy, that's autocracy. You know, Obama would say this all the time. Look, if the Chinese want to build a railroad, they just build a railroad. They don't have to go through appropriations committees and all sorts of cranky congressmen. And it's a messier system that we have, but it's one that's worth protecting and preserving.
Hi, my name is Elizabeth Sayasan. I'm a first-year MPP student. I was wondering how or if you've seen the art of speechwriting or the responsibility or necessity of speechwriters change when so much critical information or significant communication is done through the brevity of social media, just a tweet or a 60-second clip. Has that changed or affected the scope of speechwriting?
No. Speechwriting is thinking before you speak, and tweeting is speaking before you think. There's always going to be a place for good speechwriting. You know,
Can I tweet that?
Yeah, the way that Obama approached speechwriting is the same way that Lincoln and Aristotle approached speechwriting. There's just ways to do it that are good and that make a difference and that can set a direction for the country and you know, give people a new vision. And at their best, change people's minds. You know, we knew that's very difficult to do in today's environment, probably harder than ever, but we still sat down trying to do that with every speech.
Hi, my name is Jacob Steinberg. I'm a first year at the college, and I have to assume that you didn't agree with every single policy position that you wrote about or point of view that Obama had while you were working with him. How did you grapple with writing things that you didn't necessarily feel as emotionally connected to or connected to at all?
Yeah, I was very fortunate, and it always sounds like a dodge, but I was very fortunate that we agreed on almost everything. Him coming out so late on marriage equality really disappointed me. That was hard to write about in the first term. And climate change, I wish we went a lot harder in the first term than we had. But that gets back to that idea of compromising for the sake of of winning and then doing what you said. The one time I fully abdicated my responsibility was when the Green Bay Packers came to the White House. I assigned that speech to Tyler Lechtenberg on my staff, and I took the afternoon off.
I'm glad you drew the line.
Yeah.
Hello, my name is Joseph. I'm a 1L over at the law school, and my question is, did you have a specific speech or moment in the White House that you're particularly proud of outside of the 10 days?
Yeah, it's the prologue, so that's kind of cheating, but the Selma speech, that ended up being, and again, I don't think I have to keep saying that he was the chief speechwriter on that, and that we were very lucky that we had a snow day. The federal government was shut down, so I went in, all of his meetings were pulled down, and we got to work together and pass 5 drafts back and forth over the course of one day, which had never happened before or since, and they just kept getting better. And ultimately, that speech became probably the purest distillation of the way he sees this country, his vision of American exceptionalism, a truer story of America with the full cast of characters who make us who we are. And he added the thesis to that speech, which was that Selma was not a clash of armies, but a clash of wills. It was a contest to determine the true meaning of America, and I stole that as the thesis for this book. Because I think that's true of politics, too. The other one I'm proudest of is when the Chicago Cubs came to the White House after they won the World Series.
Thank you.
Hey, my name's Shahan. I'm not affiliated with the university, but just a fan of this kind of stuff. I have 2 questions. One, Obama.
At least you're not from Northwestern.
Yeah. Obama's a really funny guy. I think his correspondence speeches are pretty memorable. So first question is, who would write his jokes or who would help out with those? And then 2, what's the best piece of advice that you got from him during your time working for him?
We cast a wide net on jokes, wider than anything else. We brought in all sorts of comedy writers and just let everybody pitch. We'd give topics and just let everybody pitch 5 or 10 jokes and then just pick the best. Axe was always involved in those, and those were a lot of fun. I'm sorry, your second question was?
Oh, what's the best piece of advice that you got from him during your time?
Oh, man. One thing that always stuck with me was he said, don't assign motives to people. You know, you don't necessarily know why people are thinking the way they are. Go after their positions, go after their ideology, but don't assign motives.
Hello, I'm Kiru Ahmad. I'm actually a 3rd year at Illinois Tech down the road. My question for you is, you mentioned that you became an avid writer from being an avid reader. What were the books you liked reading growing up, and what are the books you like to read now?
Oh, great question. I haven't had time to read in a while, just between my company and teaching and writing this book. But when I was a kid, they were probably pretty straightforward. But it's a little embarrassing to admit this, but it's also true. You know, just growing up in Wilmette, it's a 97% white town, and everybody's pretty well off. And what changed my life was the public library. And it was the first time I learned about racism and injustice and unfairness and pain through books. You know, I just didn't know. There Are No Children Here by Alex Kotlowitz was about projects that were just 5 miles from where I grew up, and I had absolutely no idea. So it's a little embarrassing to say that I learned it through books. At least I learned it. But it was just books that set me on this path as much as my mother getting me into this stuff.
Hi, my name is Margaret Nachiganda. I'm a 1st year with the college, and I was wondering if you could elaborate more on your approach to writing speeches and stuff, and if you had any advice for aspiring political writers.
Yeah, sure. Just start writing as often as you possibly can. Getting a speechwriting job is really difficult. There's a catch-22 involved, which is, you know, they want to see what you've written before. But what have you written if nobody's going to hire you? So, you know, seek out professors and deans who give speeches. Write op-eds for the school paper. Those are just mini speeches and mini arguments. Write constantly and read widely. Always work to improve your writing. As far as what we did in terms of speechwriting, we'd sit down with him, ideally the president, and we'd always ask ourselves, what's the story we're trying to tell? That's a really important organizing principle before you start writing. And then I would just I'd panic for a long time staring at the blank page, but then I would just start writing, and I'd try to write the speech as quickly as I could, even if it's just very, very simple stuff. Once you kind of have that structure down, I'd go back in and revise. You know, someone once said that any good speech is 10% writing and 90% rewriting. And it was really the editing process that made each speech better.
Thank you. Well, Cody, people always say to me, well, how do you become a winning campaign strategist? What's the key to being a winning campaign strategist? I would say good taste.
You work for a winner.
Good taste, right? Pick the right person. But it's also true that presidents prosper when they have good taste and pick the right people around them. And you're such a wonderful reflection on the president you work for. And I think people will, they sense that here. You'll sense it more in the book that you buy on your way out that Cody will sign for you. But I'm so happy for your success. And it's great to see you as always. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Ax. Thank you all very much. How fun was that?
Huh?
So fun. That was so fun. Thank you.